I have some exciting news here at Cowboy Crossroads headquarters. I'll be doing my first live taping of the podcast on Friday, February 2nd, at the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada. My guests for that taping will be the legendary band Riders in the Sky. The Riders are celebrating 40 years together as a band, and it's going to be big fun to sit down with those guys and hear some great stories. If you're able to make it to Elko, I hope you'll come by and say hello and listen to the show. And if you're not able to make it to Elko, just stay tuned to the podcast, and that will be an upcoming episode. Today's episode is sponsored by Flint Custom Hats. All of my felt hats are made by Flint, and they all fit perfectly, look great, and they wear and last just like a good hat should. My friend Jared makes all of their hats the old school way, one at a time, right there in his shop in Lubbock, Texas, and he can make any hat that you'd like, and he is a great guy to work with. I'm proud to wear Flint hats, and I'm proud to have them as a sponsor of the podcast. You can find out more about Flint Custom Hats and order a hat at flinthat.com. In the spirit of the new year, and also thinking about how much I love my Flint custom hat, I'd like to read this little poem written by S. Omer Barker. It's entitled, Ranchman's Resolutions. Of New Year's resolutions, I could think up quite a few, but since I'm pretty busy, maybe 2 or 3 will do. Resolve to raise still better beef, to market when they're fat, to build new chutes, to buy new boots, but wear the same old hat. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is Gary McMahon. Gary is a singer, songwriter, yodeler, humorist, and a cowboy poet. Ramblin' Jack Elliott has called Gary the king of the cowboy singers. Chris Ledoux said that Gary is our cowboy Bob Dylan, and Dave Stamey said, Gary taught me everything I know. I sat down with Gary in a hotel room in Durango, Colorado during the Durango Cowboy Poetry Gathering and asked him to tell me the story behind his classic song, The Old Double Diamond. Here's Gary McMahon.
When I got out of the Navy in 1971, I decided I was going to try to be a cowboy songwriter, much to my dad's dismay. He owned one of the biggest cattle truck lines any place. It was out of Greeley, Colorado. He had 55 head of cattle trucks. And he wanted me to take over that truck line. And that just was not my thing, man. I couldn't stand those greasy, smelly old cattle trucks. But I did drive for him. And I worked for guys he hauled for and stuff like that. And this is Greeley, Colorado. Now, this is where they invented cattle feeding. Bill Farr invented cattle feeding. And then Kenny Montfort and Bill Webster took it. And they invented the marbling of meat and stuff like that. You know why marbling works in meat? You know why they marble meat? Is because your tongue can taste like 5 to 7 different areas on your tongue is where you taste meat. And if you don't have the marbling is that fat that runs all over your tongue, and that's the way you taste meat, is that fat runs that taste to all of those 7 places, 5 or 7. I learned this in animal science when I was going to Colorado State University. And that's why they marbled meat to begin with. And they found out that people like that. And so the cattle business in Greeley was unbelievable. They had cattle lots where you could stand in the middle of them and see nothing but cattle from horizon to horizon. They were unbelievable. And so Dad was always hauling for these guys and all that stuff. So my first initial takes on cowboying and cattle business wasn't buckaroos, and it wasn't, the old style cowboy songs and stuff like that. It all came from the commercial cattle business. And then Montfort's eventually they got bought up and changed to a company called ConAgra, which is now the biggest agricultural company in the world. And you have had ConAgra beef somewhere along the line, But when people ask me, yeah, those old cowboys are dying out, and I tell them, not really. That McDonald's hamburger that you had a mother. And that mother had somebody taking care of her. And we've got more cattle on feed right now and more cattle being raised in this country than we ever have. And they're still out there, So when I was growing up, this is all getting to the double diamond, by the way. When I was growing up, a lot of these truck drivers that used to drive for Dad, I think they're more professional now, but they used to be just these old cowboys, and they'd either get too boogered up to cowboy anymore, which happens a lot, or the pay wasn't good enough, and they had a family to raise and stuff, and so they went to truck driving. So there was a lot of these old cowboys that ran these cattle trucks and stuff like that. And I'd rather be out there with them. These guys had a perception. And it's why I stuck with them. I mean, Greeley was coming up in the world and all this kind of stuff. So there's plenty of different avenues to choose from. But these cowboys had a perception of how the world was at any given moment. Like in a corral, there's not enough time to think about the sensitive way to tell somebody something. Excuse me, but if you don't get out of the way, that bull's going to run over your ass. There's no polite way to do that. And so these guys are dealing with the here and now, and they did it so well. I learned so many lessons from them, and lots of times it wasn't politically correct or anything like that, because they just didn't have the time to be politically correct. They had to get me out of the way right then and there. We were hauling cattle one time up to Hoodoo Ranch up in Wyoming, and Dad had probably told me 100 times to never cross a chute when you run cattle up into a trailer, because you run them up into these trailers. And back in the 50s, we didn't have pots. And so back in the 50s, these were 50-foot trailers, and they had 3 gates in them. And that way the cattle couldn't bunch up in any place and tip your trailer over or do anything like that. It kind of kept them centered within a part of that trailer. And so you'd run a bunch of cattle up into a trailer, like 10 or 12 head, and you'd gate them off up there. But you had to get your bluff in on them when you're running them up the trailer. You can't have them standing there looking around going, holy cow, we're trapped. We got to get out of here. You got to run them in there and slam that gate. And those gates are made to slam and lock when you run them in. And if you miss a gate and they come back out on you, they're going to come back out in a stampede. It's a panic. And they'll come back out in that panic. And Dad had told me not to cross a chute when there's cattle being loaded. And one time up at the Hoodoo Ranch, I guess I was about 10 years old, something like that. And I crossed that chute. I wanted to get to the other side so I could hot shot a couple of them and get them. You know, they were having trouble loading them. So I was going to cross over there and run up there and see if I couldn't help. And I lost it, and I fell down in the chute at the same time they missed the gate. And I could hear them coming, and I couldn't get out quick enough. And I felt my old man's hand right on my back, just like that. And he reached down in that chute and grabbed me by the shirt and just lifted me up. And they just made a breeze down underneath me when they went out. Or it would probably kill me, you know. I mean, he actually saved my life right there. And it was always, I was always kind of slow, and he called me Speed. He said, Speed, I told you. And I said, Dad, I know you did, but now I hear you. He didn't spank me, anything like that. He didn't need to. I never crossed the chute again when they were loading cattle. But I always had these old cowboys around me, and they'd always kid me into, it wasn't a lecture. It was never a lecture. It was just, because you'll make enough mistakes to, you know, no matter what you're doing. And these cowboys could just sort of kid you into it. And they had to be kind of nice to me because I was the boss's son, but I really didn't want that. I really wanted to be one of the boys. And so all these old cowboys sort of had a real part in my raising. And then that went on into my songwriting, because every song that I write, I want to make sure that those guys would like it. And so it sort of changed my writing from what Nashville would like or what anybody else would like into whether those guys would like it. They were my chosen peer group. And so...
Did you talking about wanting to be a cowboy songwriter, was there any influences, you know, making you lean that way as far as other writers?
Sons of the Pioneers were a big influence. Folk music was a big influence on me. I would have never thought that I would like Bob Dylan until I got in the Navy, and I was in this barracks with this character by the name of John Judy, who just would not stop playing Bob Dylan over and over and over again, everything. And all of a sudden, and I hated it, you know, I just hated it. And then all of a sudden, it started making sense. And then I couldn't get enough of it. So I'd hung around. I was a surgical corpsman. I was a senior surgical corpsman at the Naval Hospital, Philadelphia, on a chest and thoracic surgery unit. And so I was there from 68 to 71. We were the East Coast receiving center for Navy and Marine Corps wounded out of Vietnam. And so this chest and thoracic surgery is heavy-duty stuff, you know. So we got a lot of amputees, a lot of Claymore mines, stuff like that. And so to get my mind off of Vietnam and the carnage and all that kind of stuff, I played a lot of music. And at that time, the folk music scene was happening. And I remember one of them, we'd go to New York, you know, me and a couple buddies would go to New York and hit the clubs down in the Village. And one night, Ramblin' Jack was playing down there. And I'm telling you, the lights came on. So I got to see James Taylor and Bonnie Raitt and Jerry Jeff Walker before they really made it. They were, you know, struggling at the coffee houses and stuff in Philadelphia and all around that whole scene, New York and Philadelphia and around. And I kind of followed them around and got a pretty good taste of that folk music scene that was just just then coming on, real strong. And Ian Tyson, stuff like that. So all of that influenced me, but I couldn't get rid of the cowboy roots. I was born and raised around rodeos and, sale yards and cattle trucks, and I used to work for the guys Dad hauled for, really, really good cowmen. If you've ever been around a really good cowman, he'll amaze you. He'll tell you about that third heifer to the left with the 3 socks, and he pulled her. She was a breech, and he pulled her, 2 years ago, and he knows all about her, and he knows all about her mom, and he knows all about her dad. And so I worked for Jack Orr at Orr Cattle Company, and Orr Cattle Company was part of the old DeBerard Cattle Company, and they brought the first Hereford bulls to this country, Anxiety Fourth Hereford bulls. And so Jack, he always wanted to be governor of Colorado, and so he was always off on some real estate scheme or something, but he knew more about cattle than anybody I knew, just off the top of his head. Didn't even want to know it. But he was running Orr Cattle Company up there. That's where he got started with his dad. And being around a cowman like that just amazed me. And of course, all the old cowboys, and they didn't know about the breeding on these cattle or anything like that. All they knew was how to run cattle, and run them up in the high country and put up hay and stuff like that. And but they still had a grasp. I don't know if I can convey that to you. The Double Diamond is out of that. Is out of that admiration for these guys that could look around and assess a situation like that. And there were no frills, there was no ideology or anything. If anything, there was a little bit of humor mixed in with it, just something that a little bit of sugar makes the medicine go down, that kind of stuff. But I never could find another type of people that were that aware. So that's who I wanted to write for. I figured if these songs that I would write would pass muster with these guys, then that's all I needed to pass muster. I never thought I'd write a million seller or anything like that, as long as they pass muster with the cowboys, the real cowboys. And I'm still that way today. Even these cowboy poetry gatherings, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance at these deals, And every once in a while, there's 2 or 3 old cowboys out there in the audience sitting there. And that's who I'm singing to. Tell you just a little funny aside. One time when I was learning how to drive a truck, I was probably 16, 17 years old, and Dad put me with this beat-up old cowboy, ornery old fart by the name of Phil Tan was his name. And been in more wrecks than you could count, and he's all crippled up in his hands and stuff, but he drove cattle trucks and stuff, and Dad put Phil in with me and told him to teach me how to drive a truck. And Phil just hated it. Just, oh no, I got to sit here with this little shit. And you'd get in a big truck and it's like an aircraft carrier to a kid, and here's all these buttons and dials and stuff. And Phil said, you see this, 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 and that. Don't F with them. So, anyway, one time Phil and I are driving the bobtail truck This is on a Friday, sale day. And so we got up early and we'd go around and make the rounds. We'd come back with a crate of chickens, a milk cow, a steer, 2 pups, and maybe a box of cats. People would just give them to us to take to the sale. And so we'd deliver them to the sale, and Phil would show me how to drive the truck and make sure I knew how to load cattle and all that kind of stuff. And one day we got called up to Greeley Producers to load a bull. And it was a bull that was going out to Fay Yetter's place. Fay Yetter was an old brand inspector out east of Greeley. And Fay had his own rig. We wondered, well, why didn't Fay come get his bull, you know? And what had happened was Fay tried, and they couldn't load that bull. And that bull was taking everything that come through that pen. And these sale barn cowboys had been trying to load that bull all day long, and nobody could get it done. So they called LTI. That was the name of Dad's truck line, Livestock Transport Incorporated. They called LTI and figured they'd give us a shot at it. So nobody told us anything. So here's this 17-year-old kid and this old broken-down cowboy show up in a bobtail truck to load this bull. And these feedlot cowboys, I noticed we kind of had a crowd around us. You know, there were 4 or 5 guys on horses just kind of sitting there. But, you know, those chicken shit bastards wouldn't say a word. They just wanted to, you know, an old man and a kid, and they wouldn't warn us that this bull had been on the take all day. And so we just got there, you know, and Phil said, well, you open the gate and I'll shoo him in. And so I went up there and opened the gate, and Phil crawled down into the corral. You know, it's a little crowding corral. Wasn't very big, you know. And this bull just takes him and knocks him down. And Phil picks up this chunk of concrete, just, you know, out of there. It was a pretty good-sized chunk of concrete. Said, why, you son of a bitch. And he threw that concrete at that bull's head, and he hit him right between the eyes. And I'll swear you could see Saturn and Pluto and Tweety birds and stuff going around that bull's head. And then Phil went, yeah, like that. And that bull just kind of stumbled up that chute and got in the truck, and I dropped the gate on him, and away we went. And that's one of the ways he loaded proddy bulls, I found out later, was he'd just find a rock and hit them in the head with it, and then while they were still dazed, he'd get them up to shoot. Well, these cowboys have been working on it all day with ropes and all kinds of stuff. But it was those kind of lessons, you know, that were... I've just never run into guys like that just had that savvy ability about them. And so, anyway, that's what I wanted to do. And so, 1971, after I got out of the Navy, I did a little bit of knocking around, worked on a few cow outfits, and then went out to California and got in a band with this gal by the name of Jill Croston, who later became Lacey J. Dalton. And she and I had this band called Brer Rabbit, and it was a hippie band. And so I played out there for a while. And, you know, there again, I looked around and said, you know, here's all these... We had this motorcycle gang that used to come to our gigs, and they liked us. And we were playing folky music, you know, stuff, and country and stuff like that. But this motorcycle gang, it depended on what drug they bought that week, where they were. If they bought uppers, they'd be, you know, happy and dancing and all this kind of stuff. And if they bought a bunch of Quaaludes, then they'd all be down in the dumps. But they always showed up at the gigs. And you never knew what their personality was going to be. And I looked around at that and I said, you know, I know better people than this. I don't need to be here. You know, this is supposedly the cool, it was Santa Cruz in the early 70s, and it was freaking out, boy. And I thought, I can't do that. So I went back and worked for Jack through the summer and part of the fall, and then made enough money to go to Nashville. And I thought, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to go down there and see how the big boys do it. And so I got down there and found out that the guy pumping your gas could play better than you could, you know, and sing and write. And met all these fabulous people down there, Guy Clark, Towns Van Sant, you know, all these guys that were hanging around Nashville at the time.
The Old Double Diamond has been recorded by well over 100 artists, including Ian Tyson, Chris Ledoux, Rod Taylor, Dave Stamey, and most recently, Bryn Hill. It's truly become a modern-day classic. Here's a quote from cowboy actor Barry Corbin. Gary McMahon wrote The Old Double Diamond, and it is the best cowboy song I've ever heard. Not just currently. In my opinion, it is the best cowboy song of all time.
So I made periodic forays back to Colorado. Dad was just begging me to come back and take that truck line, you know, and I just wouldn't do it. I felt like a failure, but I was going to stick with this. I was going to do it. And so I decided that I would do that. And on one of those forays, he took me fishing up in Du Bois. And we went to Ab Cross's place. It's the old Cross Ranch out there by Togety Pass. And we fished for a couple of days with Ab, too. He went fishing with us. And we were getting ready to leave. And Ab said, well, you can't go today. The Double Diamond's up for sale. They're going to sell it on the auction block today. He said, everybody's going to the sale. He said, you guys need to be there. That's all there is to it. You need to see this old ranch sell. Because it was famous kind of in its own right, but it was part of the old Mill Iron Ranch. And the Mill Iron Ranch, the Double Diamond was, from what I can gather, was the last point west on the old Mill Iron Ranch that you could get your horse shot and a hot meal before you headed off into that country that from Du Bois over to the Tetons. Awesome country, by the way. But that was part of the old Mill Iron Ranch. And so it was famous for lots of reasons up there. And they'd had some bad luck, and they'd had a Brannon fire up there. They'd gotten a couple of propane bottles too close to the fire, and they'd blown up and killed some people. And the guys that were wearing Levi jackets and cotton jackets and wool jackets just had their mustache and their eyebrows singed, and the guys that were wearing nylon burned to death. It just stuck right to them. At fireball, you know, ignited that nylon, and nylon won't stop burning, and they couldn't get it off. And so it was a hell of a deal. They still talk about that fire. And anyway, the plaintiff's lawyer is the one who bought the Double Diamond Ranch, Jerry Spence. You know, they got sued and all that kind of stuff, and Spence wound up with that ranch up there, and he turned it into a trial lawyer college, which the locals call trail liar. But anyway, I didn't know any of this. So we watched this ranch sale, and there's these old cowboys up there, just like the ones down in Greeley. And there were no buckaroos or anything like that, We didn't know about I knew the word buckaroo, but nobody had ever met one. They were just cowboys. And there's these guys, and they were running the horses through the sale and then running the cattle through, and they did their jobs, and when they got done, they loaded their duffel and their saddles in this old pickup and took off down the road. And so the next day we stayed at Abbs that night, and the next day Dad and I drove back down to Greeley, and I wrote that song. I didn't complete it probably for about 8 months, but I wrote the bones to it. And then just kind of filled it in over the next 8 or 10 months, something like that. And I think that song is partially responsible for changing the way that people perceive Western music. Because, I love the Sons of the Pioneers and Roy Rogers and Gene Autry and all those guys, loved what they did and stuff. But their songs weren't real cowboy songs. They were, if anything, they were not real cowboy songs. They were just, but the musicality of it all, the musicality of the Sons of the Pioneers and the way they put those tunes together, and the way they were produced and the way their harmonies came into it and all that kind of stuff was just wonderful. So I think I got a good appreciation of the music at that point. I got a good appreciation of what is a good melody and what's not, what's a good beat and what's not, and how do you blend the words with the song to make something more than either one. And when you get it right, that's the magic of songwriting.
Did you know you had it right? Did you know what you had when you wrote Double Diamond?
No, I thought it was a pretty good song. I thought it rang true. And Nashville, of course, wasn't after a ring true good song. They wanted the next hit. So there was always that. But I never really aspired to be that. I never really wanted to write for a publishing company or something. Some of the guys, I had this little shack on Music Row. It was 717 17th Avenue South. And it was right across from the fire station, right down the street from CBS. RCA. Chet Atkins was there and stuff. And I'd get songwriter buddies of mine coming by all the time because they were always making the rounds. And one of them was Shel Silverstein. And he was telling me, man, that is a great song, but it's never going to go anyplace, And Shel had come in with a shoebox full of checks. He said, look what happens when these songs go someplace. And some of those checks were like $17,000, and he'd been saving them up, and he was on his way to the bank to put them in the bank. But Shel Silverstein was a great guy. He was a great guy. And he knew what he was doing when he wrote, Hey, Loretta, love you better than my Irish setter. He knew what he was doing. But it was those sort of influences, that came along. But anyway, when I wrote the Double Diamond, and it just sat there, and I played it out, at these songwriter deals and stuff like that, and everybody'd say, yeah, that's a pretty good song. And one night, Bonnie Talent, she was head A&R for CBS Records. And Bonnie and I were good friends. She was a horsey gal and, you know, that kind of stuff. And, or Bonnie Gardner, she changed her name a couple of times. It was Bonnie Gardner when she was with CBS Records. And she put together the Highwaymen, Johnny Cash, and that was her deal. And so Bonnie was all over it. Well, Tyson had come to town, and he was looking for a record deal. And so Bonnie told him, said, listen, there's this kid down on Music Row. He said, you need to meet him. And so she just shows up one night with Ian Tyson on the porch. And, you know, he comes in, and I was living, it was this old shack, and it was cut in half. It was a house, and it was cut in half, and I had 3 fireplaces in each one of my 3 rooms, none of which I used, and I don't think they worked. But it was this old Tennessee house, and the other half belonged to this painter, house painter, and his wife, and he'd get drunk and beat up his wife and stuff like that. It was real Tennessee, you know, but it was right there on Music Row. And so Tyson loved it. I had spittoons around the place, you know, and a bottle of whiskey and stuff. And we sat down, shot the shit for a little bit and drank a little whiskey, and we started playing each other's songs. And I played him the Double Diamond. And he looked at me, and he batted his eyes, and he said, sing that again. So I sang it to him again, and I sang it to him 10 times in a row. And he said, that's a great song. I'm going to record that. I'm going to record that song. And, whoa, you know, all of a sudden, hallelujah, you know. And it took him a while. It took him until 82, I think, to release it on Old Corrals and Sagebrush. But in the meantime, Chris Ledoux had recorded it. Chris had cut a bunch of my songs. He was on the road, you know, rodeoing. And his brother Mike was selling the records out of the back of his truck. And Chris was sort of treating it like, well, yeah, it's kind of nice. And his dad was driving force behind it. And his dad was wanting cowboy songs, as many as he could get, Chris could do, because he was selling these albums, you know. And his dad thought, boy, this would be great. And so Chris and I would get together, and I'd sing him all these songs, and he never was really too impressed with anything, including the old Double Diamond, but he wasn't writing anything. He was too busy rodeoing. So he took these songs and he put them on his albums. And a lot of his fans still love those old songs. I've been singing up in Wyoming before, and just damn near getting a fist fight, you know, when I tell somebody I wrote that song, and then I'll do the song. Some, you know, cowboy comes up that had a couple of drinks in him, said, bullshit, Chris Ledoux wrote that song. And I never did argue with him. He got me. You know, I learned how to avoid fights in Wyoming bars by just agreeing with them or kidding them or something like that. So anyway, Chris cut it, and then Chris and I were doing a bunch of shows up in Wyoming and around. And about this time, the Cowboy Poetry Gatherings came along. And not the gatherings, the gathering in Elko, you know. And Hal started that in 85, I guess. And I saw a poster for it. And I thought, boy, I'd sure like to go to that. I wonder what that's all about. And, you know, up until this time, from the time I went to Nashville, the Sons of the Pioneers were dead. Western music was dead. Any old cowboy singers were relegated to history. I mean, I'm sure there was some guys still singing old cowboy songs out here, but I didn't know them, and I got around. The only guys I knew that were at least committed to writing contemporary Western music was me and Ian Tyson and Chris Ledoux. It's the only guys I know. And then there was another guy, kind of a fluke out of the whole deal, by the name of Bob Frank, who had an album out on Vanguard Records. And Bob used to work some of the ranches out here. He was a kid from Memphis. And kind of a quirky kind of guy, but he could write a song. He had a way with words and songs. And he could write a song, and he wrote several songs that I just loved, you know. And I used to bartend at the Exit Inn, and Bob was playing there one time when that record came out. And so I got about a week of him. I was bartending, so I heard him every night, 3 sets a night, you know. And we got to be great friends, still are. And Bob wrote some wonderful cowboy songs. And so Bob, me, Chris, and Ian were the only guys that were even talking like contemporary Western music. Nashville wasn't even in the picture. And none of us had an idea that the poetry gatherings were going to come along. You know, who knew that? So when they did come along, all of a sudden, I wasn't invited. They didn't know who I was in '85, but I showed up. And the reason I showed up was because I bought a new pickup. I was running stagecoaches and sleigh rides and the stables for the T Lazy 7 Ranch up at Aspen. In the summertime, we were running 185 head of horses up there. It was a busy place. But anyway, the boss knew that I was kind of burned out on the stagecoach and stuff, and he said, "Why don't you go to the poetry gathering?" But I didn't have enough money, except that it hailed up there, and it hailed on my new truck, and I got a check for about $800. And all of a sudden, I had enough money to go to the poetry gathering. So I went, and I ran into lots of people who knew my songs there that didn't know me. You know, I mean, they could quote my songs word for word, Chris Ledoux albums, and Ian had put that the Double Diamond out in '82. You know, so it had been recorded a couple other times. Once by a band by the name of the Starlight Ramblers, who really were just a local hit in Colorado, running up and down the Front Range, but they were fabulously successful. And they did a bunch of my songs, and people knew who they were. And then the Double Diamond just sort of ran out the door, and it started making its own way. And, you know, I ran into lots of people. You know, it was kind of my entry. I thought, wow, this is my kind of deal, my kind of audience. And so from that, the gathering spread out really fast. You know, Durango's one of them. You know, and after the first one, I think it was in '86, I came back and actually did some shows. It's when Hal Cannon said, yeah, you need to come do some shows. And people loved them. And so it started getting popular. you know. And about that time, I met Baxter. I'd known about him. You know, he was that vet from Brighton, the funny guy from Brighton. But Baxter was hitting his stride at the same time. And Baxter is such a cool guy. He sat me down one night. We were both drunk. And he said, you can do this. He said, these stockmen's gatherings and stuff like that, he said, they're all looking for something real, you know, something they can relate to, somebody that has stories. And he said, you got them the same as me. And he said, you have the talent to do that. And he said, I'll leave you my crumbs, which he did. He, you know, if he couldn't play them, he'd tell them to call me. And so all of a sudden I was making money at this.
Here's some words from Ian Tyson about Gary McMahon and the old Double Diamond. Back in the early 70s, I'd make periodic forays to Nashville in the hopes of getting something going in the recording business. Gary had a wooden shack just off of Music Circle. I'd head over there and we'd spit tobacco and conjecture a world in which real cowboy songs were highly prized. It was then that Gary played his classic Old Double Diamond for me. The sagebrush wind blew right through that song and still does. The Old Double Diamond became a fan favorite in Ian Tyson's back catalog and was even included in Ian's 1996 collection of greatest hits titled All the Good'uns. But Gary didn't know just how successful Ian's recording had become until the two of them were having breakfast one day at Stockman's in Elko, Nevada.
Yeah, we were both at the poetry gathering out in Elko, and we both had shows and stuff. I think we'd done a couple shows together. And anyway, so he likes to get up and go down to the Stockman's and have coffee and eggs and stuff, and I do too. And I just stumbled onto him in there one morning. We got sitting down and talking, and I don't know, we started talking about money or something. And I said, yeah, I sure would like to get... He was telling me that the Double Diamond had been a hit in Canada, an FM hit in Canada for years up there. And I said, boy, I sure would like to see some of that money. And he looked at me and he said, you've never been paid? And I said, no, I've never seen a check from Stony Plains or anybody else. And he just stood up and he went over to the payphone, and I heard a bunch of sons of bitches and you motherfuckers this and by God that's and stuff. And he was holding court. He was having a come to Jesus meeting over there. And about a week later, I got a check in the mail from them. But he didn't know all that was going on.
Would you feel like playing?
Yeah, I'll play you
Diamond for me.
I will do it. I'm trying to think if there's anything. I wanted to give you the background of why and I've written several of them that that the cowboys like them. And I do a lot of things other than these poetry gatherings, and like I was telling you, it means a lot when sure enough old cowboy will come up to you and say, man, play that, whatever it is. I got one called The Blizzard and one called Pappy's Lament. And there's a poem called A Cowboy Day that's always done down on the Bell Ranch whenever they ride out on Sunday mornings when we used to have gatherings down there. And that was cowboy gatherings. That wasn't a poetry gathering. It was just a bunch of cowboys got together. Now the old double diamond lay out east to Du Bois in the land of the buffalo, and the auctioneer's gavel rapped and it rattled as I watched the old double diamond go. And won't you listen to the wind, Mother Nature's violin? When I first hired on the old double diamond, I was a damn poor excuse for a man. Never learned how to aim when the spirit was tame. Couldn't see all the cards in my hand. And the wind whipped the granite above me, blew the tumbleweeds clean through my soul. I fought her winters, busted her horses. You know, it took more than I thought I could stand. But the battles with the mountains and cattle seem to bring out the best in a man. I guess a sailor, he needs an ocean, and a mama, her babies to hold. And I need the hills of Wyoming in the land of the buffalo. Now she's selling out and I'm moving on, but I'm leaving with more than I came. 'Cause I got this saddle and it ain't for sale, and I got this song to sing. I got a new range to find and new knots to tie, in a country where cowboys are kings. I turned my tail to the wind, and the old double diamond disappeared into the sage. Hey, there you
Beautiful.
be. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Man.
Yeah.
Love that.
Glad you love it. I love it too. You know, they never get old. Those songs, a really well-written song just never gets old.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Gary McMahon for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Gary at singingcowboy.com. I'd like to thank Flint Custom Hats for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about them and order a hat at flinthat.com. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help support it, you could do me a favor by giving me a rating and writing a review in the iTunes store. You could also help me spread the word. Just tell a friend that you think might enjoy the show. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to Andy@andyhedges.com. cowboyscrossroads.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.